welcome to With You Podcast,
where we explore relationships and life transitions.
I'm David.
And I'm Tara.
And we have been traveling.
Surprise. This is always the story. I think people are probably getting really sick of this.
Probably.
Here we are again. We've been away. Yep. This has been a month of a lot of travel, and we're about to leave again. But we want to talk about what you did for a little bit.
So I was about 5,000 miles away. I was in Bratislava, Slovakia. Now, until recently, I didn't know where that was. Like 6 years.
Yeah.
And
that recent.
That recent. But I got to go and talk with some business leaders on how to live faithfully out your faith, Christianity, in the workplace, and then talk with parents doing a parenting workshop. Now, the problem with the parenting workshop is you weren't there.
I know. Well, again, you got invited after I'd already committed to something else. And so we had to be in separate places again. So you were all the way in Slovakia. We almost at the exact same times.
Yeah.
You went to Slovakia and got to meet, and we have friends in Slovakia now because you've had students from there. And
yeah, well, let me tell you one funny story about that before you say where you were.
Yeah.
So did some trainings, and then there's another colleague of mine. So we decided one night after all the meetings, we'd go to a jazz club in Bratislava to listen to blues. And so
as one does.
Yeah. So we get to this jazz bar, and we hear our names called. And we're like, what? And it was people that we had taught before that had been in the summer program at Wheaton. And they're like, what are two Wheaton professors doing in Bratislava at a blues club?
Only this is not unusual for you. I found this out when I joined your family, that you could be anywhere in the world and you'll run into people and you're not even looking for them. They'll find you.
No, yeah. And it was a little surprising. It was fun because they were like, what are you doing? And then they came to church with us the next day. But it was... my buddy was like, does this happen to you? This is weird. And I'm like, oh, this is a Van Dyke thing. My mom never met someone that wasn't a future friend.
Yeah.
And we just have connections all over the world. So that was, it's a small world on some level. It was fun to see those friends. And they were asking,
it is for you.
Where's Tara? And I'm like, well, I've substituted Tara with a Wheaton faculty member.
Okay.
It wasn't as much fun.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
You never have too much fun.
So while I was working so hard and then going to listen to blues, which was funny because it was an all Slovakian audience. So they're speaking Slovak.
Oh, yeah. And were the blues I'm sure they were in Slovakian.
No, they sang in English.
They sang in English.
Yeah. So it was like House of the Rising Sun. And so we were having a conversation of, do you think they've ever been to New Orleans? And kind of struggling with this. And we could tell from the singer, she had some life experience. She put it into the song, but probably not from New Orleans.
Probably not.
So it was really funny because the music, we were way into it. And then they would start saying things and everybody was laughing. And we're like, had no idea what was happening.
They'd have commentary in
before
Slovakian.
and after. Yeah. And we stood out. So... it was.
You can always tell who people are who don't quite belong.
It was an evening, but man, one of the band members could play the harmonica. Holy moly! It was
that sounds
harmonica
fun.
Blues. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed that.
I know we haven't really caught up. I just got home late last night.
So, we've had a walk.
So part of this is us just kind of reconnecting to catch up with each other.
We always say that. It's not wrong.
No, it's not wrong. So I was there. Where were you?
So I was also working.
Wait, what? Without me?
Well, this is something that wasn't an overlap for you. So This was my conference for ICEA, which is my certifying organization. It stands for International Childbirth Educators Association. Oh, no. Education Association.
Education.
I always confuse that. And I've been on the board, and now I'm on the conference committee. So I helped put together this conference.
Okay.
And it was in San Antonio, Texas, which was fun because that's where I was born, and I haven't been there since.
Nice. Did you go visit the hospital?
No, I was born on an army base. I would have had trouble getting onto the army base. But it was in beautiful San Antonio, Texas. And mostly I spent my time inside in the hotel, which is never that fun.
No.
But I got to present a session too on... and so the people who attend this conference are mostly childbirth educators, birth doulas, postpartum doulas, and some nurses and a few midwives. So all people who are working with families in the perinatal period and preparing them for the transition to parenthood.
Yeah.
So the little session that I did was in a skills kind of training session where there were stations, and I got to teach on Gottman's, just teaching them a skill for how to have give a couple an opportunity to build affection and connection and to strengthen their relationship.
Hey.
Because we know the research shows that when people become new parents, relationship satisfaction goes down.
Weird, right?
Sometimes
That's
just
strange.
temporarily.
Yeah.
It's just like you have a lot of new stressors in life. And so building them up at that time, helping them find connection can really help a child's life too.
Yeah, when you're under stress, you want to turn towards
Yeah.
rather than turning away or inward.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
So I got to do that, and I got to connect with a lot of my peers and also people I really look up to in the business. And so it was good.
Oh, and I'm glad we're back together. The next thing we get to do together. So that's good.
Yes. We'll be traveling in a few more days.
We don't need to talk about that right now. But what is interesting is I think from both of our conference times, mine and yours, that we came up with this idea of, man, people feel a lot of pressure based on expectations.
Oh, are we diving into our topic now?
Yeah.
So should we present what we're talking about?
Oh, yeah. That would be good. I am still a little jet lagged.
Well, you just got back from a very different time zone a few hours ago. Okay. So just to be perfectly transparent, we had other plans in place for things we wanted to talk about. And we planned to get some people, when they podcast, they batch record way ahead of time, which would be really smart for us.
That would be smart.
And was our intention. And we had some plans to get ahead of things this season, but we're kind of just barely keeping our heads above water.
That's right.
And so here we are recording one that we're going to drop tomorrow. And we had plans for some interviews that just we haven't, it's, partly our problem. We haven't been able to squeeze things in. So this one came up
in the car from the airport
on the way
night.
from the airport. Like, we got to do something. And it's not hard to come up with topics related to pain for us.
Correct.
We deal with a lot of pain. And we love to talk about play, which we've done this season. And this one actually was, what we're going to talk about today was kind of stimulated or inspired by a conversation I had this weekend with somebody who said, I don't want to listen to basically to your podcast or to because and her reason was, I feel like listening to somebody else who I think has it all together makes me feel like I'm a mess.
Oh.
And I was like, let me disabuse you of that but it really made me sad in a way, because it reminded me that we all think other people, we see a glimpse into somebody else's life or career or whatever.
Or social media.
And we think, well, I'm a mess because they're way ahead of me or they have it together. And that can hold us back from growth, because we just get frozen and thinking, well, I'll just never be there.
Yeah.
And so we thought we'd talk about the pain of perfectionism, or the pain of, how it can hurt us by trying to play the comparison game, basically.
That's right. And we have lots of examples where I think people see one thing and then don't see the other. And this came up for me because we typically do the parenting workshop together.
Yeah.
And so I was at a place called C.S. Lewis High School. And we have a slide deck, and one of the slides has 4 pictures. One was a picture of the Holy Family.
Okay, yeah, and let me talk about that, because this particular slide in our parenting presentation has to do with this exact thing. It's about, why do a lot of parents feel unsatisfied with how
parenting.
they're doing, because they have these pictures that they see on media or in their community that they think are, better in their family. So we have representations of that.
And talking about where do our expectations come from? Where do our images about parenting comes from?
Yeah.
And there's 4 pictures: the Holy Family, the Royal Family,
from the UK.
From the UK, William and Kate, or I said Prince William and Princess
That's
Catherine.
right.
There was a old black and white picture of a family, which is family of origin, the family
Yeah.
we
So,
come from, and a picture of the Simpson family.
because that was for you.
The cartoon,
Yeah.
right? Not O.J. Simpson,
Oh,
but
right.
the cartoon, the Simpsons family with Bart and Marge and Homer. And so I'm giving the talk. I recognize 3 of those pictures in the points. And then we get to the royal family and I'm like, I have no idea why this one's here.
Why Tara put that there?
Yeah, and you all miss out because she's not here. And one of the people in the front raised their hand and said, "Oh, it's the royal family because we only see the best pictures and them dressed pretty and all the expectations, and we don't see the mess behind." And I was like, "That's a real whether that's true or not, whether that's Tara's point or not. We're going to go with that."
Well, and I changed those pictures depending on our audience because we presented the same thing in an American context, and I put up influencers,
Yeah. Which I really wouldn't have known any of them or what the
Yeah.
points were. So,
Yeah.
but it was you had that experience of someone saying, "I'm not going to listen to your podcast because it'll make me feel horrible."
Yeah.
And our conversation in terms of parenting are here are the images we have that sets the expectation, and we're all far from perfect, even those pictures. The only one that's really honestly is The Simpsons. And
Yeah, they don't pretend to be perfect.
No, we see the imperfection, which I think is why they've gone 30 plus years in terms of an adult cartoon, because it's kind of more maps onto people's experiences.
Probably.
So this was the conversation that
That's
we
how
had
we got
in the car,
here.
and this is how we got here. So maybe we can dive into this, how expectations set us up for hurt, and not all the time, but like the performance pressure.
Yeah, and I think we both are competitive type people, and we've seen in our family too how sometimes performance pressure can actually be motivating in a positive way.
Yeah.
But it can also really lead to distortion of what's realistic and distortion of our own views of ourselves, and can lead to shame.
Yeah.
And
I think it's the pursuit of perfection. It's not about not being excellent or trying, but it's the pursuit of something that's unrealistic. That's a image of something that leads and creates traps of shame, traps of expectations that are unattainable, and distorts our relationship. That
because it's
I'm not perfect for you,
right?
And then it's like, well, maybe there is someone that's out there, and so it puts marital distress,
right?
Not because of anything going on other than, oh, I think it should be different.
Because of the comparison game, I think, because it's the pursuit of perfection and the illusion of somebody else is doing better than I am.
Yeah. That is so hard.
Yeah. So where does that pressure to perform come from in relationships? I mean, that's kind of where we're starting, is like, what's the definition of success that we're striving for?
Yeah. And for us, both in the education that we've had in birth, in marriage and family therapy, the focus is on the process. But that's not the way it is in business. That's not the way it is in culture. No. There's like an outcome that drives
we like
everything.
Markers. Yeah. We like measurable success.
Well, even education, right? The thing that drives me crazy about education and sometimes teaching undergrads is that they want to figure out what I want from them and give me that so they can get the grade.
Well, we're going to talk more about that. You put that in our little outline for later.
Oh yeah. I should follow the outline. I am not perfect.
I'm going to have to work harder to keep you on track this time.
I know. I'm floating around a little bit still in the plane. So.
Yeah, but I mean, it is true that that's part of the problem, but that our measure of what we're shooting for is not based on the process. It's based on really visible, measurable markers of success. Yeah. And so people want to know, like, how am I doing? And how am I doing in comparison to that guy, or, this rubric. And So that sets us up for feeling like there's always somebody who's doing better than we are.
Yeah. Well, and especially if you're like in average, that means there's half of the group are doing better than you are. Half the group are doing worse. And it's really the pressure to perform rather than to live. I mean, we love focusing on being with. Well, being with is different than performing.
Yes.
Like, how am I going to be with you? Like, if every interaction, we then afterwards had a breakdown of, here's where you let go, here's where, because there's lots of disappointments.
Yeah.
There's lots of failures. And with a striving to excellence, we can sometimes get stuck on all the problematic pieces and not look at and appreciate the intent, the vulnerability, the process. And so I think that for me is where the illusion of perfection, that there is this perfect way of being, there is this perfect way of parenting, there is this perfect partner. I think everybody listening, you and I know, that's just not the case. It's hard to be consistent, whether it's consistently bad or consistently perfect. Everybody, there's always exceptions. And what do we focus on?
Yeah.
So that's
what do we focus on?
Yeah.
So we thought we'd just go into some applications of this, like places in life where this shows up a lot.
Yeah.
Where we need to find out how we balance excellence and authenticity. Like, how do you get those two things in balance? Because I think we value authenticity in our culture.
Yeah.
But there's a tension between those. Between being real and being perfect,
Yeah. Well, and and when we were having this conversation, one time jumped out for me in terms of fakery or trying to get the right look. But the process of getting the right look is a hot mess. And it was when we were living in Hungary. We had, I think we were sitting on a square in Eger having a cup of coffee. And we noticed this couple come, and there's a fountain in the square. So it's St. Istvan Square, and there's this fountain, and the fountain is where there's jets in the pavement. So you don't necessarily see them in the jet.
It seemed to be a hot Instagram spot.
Yeah.
Yes,
there was
fountain.
Lots of people. And then there was this couple. Well, and I assume they were a couple because that guy took such a beating that they would have to.
Why does that make them a couple?
Because I'm not sure anyone would tolerate.
He was doing a lot of work to please her.
He was doing a whole lot of work. And so she was the model and wanting to get this picture by water squirting up behind her. I don't know. And so we're sitting there watching, and it started out just curiosity of like, why are they taking a picture there? And she would kind of move her, like put one foot forward and bend a knee. And
all the Instagram poses.
What's this called?
Duck lips.
Duck lips. She was doing all of that, and he would take a picture. She would come look, and then there would be lots of discussion in Hungarian. And then they would go and reset it and do it again. And I remember him laying on the ground and standing up. And I mean, it was remarkable. And then the conversation started to get a little more animated. In terms of like, you're not doing it right. And so we sat there and watched, and we were giggling and just like, hey, it's coffee and a show. And we got to watch them. But it speaks to this kind of social media fakery. It took them probably a half an hour to get one picture that she was going to use on her Instagram.
Right.
And the relational damage that happened during that time
it was a
remarkable.
Great expense for this perfect shot that people will think, gosh, she just walked past that fountain and just looked so perfect with her hair, and nobody knows.
Yeah, that there's this whole story around one picture, and the backstory is something completely different. Now, every time I see any post on Facebook or Instagram, I am like, oh, I tell a whole interesting story in my head of the backstory of what that was, because you see the pain, the suffering, the struggle, it's not a natural, vulnerable, spontaneous moment. It's
to
crafted.
present. It's crafted. That's a good way to put it.
For a certain experience. And then we, the people that are experiencing it, think, look at the wonderful time they're having traveling internationally. And we have envy, or we think my life isn't like that. And it doesn't map on to the one image, but it's that one image pulled out of the perspective of something bigger.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh, but that happens all the time.
Yeah.
It happens for everybody.
It does happen all the time. And we were thinking one of the contexts that it's pretty, we've talked about this before, just of churches that we've attended is, in churches, in any place where communities gather, in the elementary school. Oh my goodness. Okay, let's start.
I just had a flashback.
I know. Let's just start with the elementary school.
Okay.
Because that was a whole thing at our public school where our kids went. You would drop your kids off and pick them up. At least most people did. Some kids could walk to school. So there was a whole culture around the moms or the parents or the caregivers waiting to pick up their children, waiting and talking, and who's with who, and who's dressed nicely, and who's in their sweats, and who just rolled out of bed, and
who's staying in their car just parked on the street.
Well, I was that mom at some point. Like, I couldn't stand the dynamics of figuring out who was going to let me talk to them or whatever. So I got to a point after I'd already fought through that for the first couple of kids where I just parked my car around the block.
Tell the kids, hey.
Sat in the car, walk down the block, you'll find me in that parking space because of the comparison game. Because then you'd hear them talking about somebody else or talking about somebody else who wasn't there or walking up. And so the pressure of that was really uncomfortable.
Yeah. And we felt that too. So there was the social aspect of parents comparing, and also your experience of, people are talking about each other. And so then it's like, what are they saying about me? But also the pressure in parenting of, like, if your child doesn't play professional soccer at the age of 2, they will never play in high school. Now, I guess travel soccer at the age of 2, they'll never play soccer in high school.
Yeah, that was a big disillusionment, or
I would say a lie from the pit of purgatory.
Yeah, we had to learn that. I'd say we didn't learn that right up front. We struggled with that.
We kind of need to apologize to our firstborn.
But I remember the first time I realized what a big deal it was, the sports culture and the comparison and the pressure, when we put our first child in a little, what we thought was low impact, low stress, low stakes, park district soccer at the age of 5 or 6.
Yeah. He was
first grade, or, I thought, wow, this is like
young,
really young, but it'll give him something fun to do and run around. And I was standing on the sidelines watching him, run in circles. He'd never played soccer with a group of kids before. So he wasn't particularly, understanding
aware.
The object of the game. And one mom kind of sidled up to me and said, "Is this his first time playing soccer?"
Yeah.
And I'm like, "He's 5." Yeah. And she was like, "Oh." Kind of like he's got some work to do to catch up with everybody.
He's going to be slow. And
I'm thinking, he's 5. I didn't know you could even play a sport before that.
And so think about that pressure, right? So you were there just having a good time. He's getting out running.
Yeah.
And then a fun event, a sport event becomes meaningful for his well-being as a high school and young adult.
Well, and then it really, the parents start to push their kids to be the top of this youth sport at this very young, instead of, our goal when we signed our kids up was really just that they'd get sweaty, they'd get dirty, they'd have some fun, they'd learn some rules, they'd have to listen to a coach other than their parents.
And they'd give us like a half an hour to sit on the sidelines and chill.
With the other 3 kids.
Running around,
But that should be the goal. We really came into it thinking the process was important. But you get caught up in this, if my kid's the one picking dandelions in the corner, then everybody's shaming me too, you know?
Like you're a bad parent because your child is just running around and not running within the lines.
Right.
And it was just, and we got sucked into that
I think we did.
for a little bit.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, are we good enough parents? We're not doing this. We're not spending X amount of money for travel, baseball, or
should get a private coach. You should be throwing the ball with them every weekend in the backyard. And
it was
not for fun, but to make them better.
Yeah, because that's going to be how they make their money as a professional athlete.
They'll all be professional.
Which is crazy. Now that you we say that out loud, it was crazy. But the pressure in the moment, and I think about the wear and tear, because that's pressure just in a recreational event, and then things happen, and you're already queued up with pressure to. It has relational struggles for marriages, for parenting, that is unnecessary, but we get caught up in this kind of pursuit for excellence or pursuit for perfection or trying the shoulds. I guess everyone in our community is doing that, and so we should do that, and we should all over ourselves and need to step away from that. I think another place, this is harder to talk about, but another place where that happens is in places of worship. I think that you've worked in a church. I get to speak in churches. We did some talking together and faith-based things. And we want to be excellent as an act of worship, right? So do your best, try your best. That's a way of pleasing God. And yet that can be the outcome of I'm only okay if we have the best music. Like there's professional musicians. And we're going to talk about these things. It's not like we have anything against that, but it's when the process overtakes the purpose that it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
Ooh, a lot of P words. But it's like, if we want to have all professional musicians, let's just say for an example, well, then there's no way the youth ministry, the kids are going to be using their skills, learning how to develop, and because it needs to be perfect. And if you've been to a middle school band or orchestra concert, it is not perfect. But then what are we communicating? You have to get perfect before you can be on the worship team.
Right. And that sends a big message. And I think that is an overall thing that a lot of people mistake about what qualifies them to even come to church. I think some people think I've got to have it all pulled together before I even show up at church, because they assume everybody else has got it all together. And we present our best front, which, what story is that bringing up for you?
There's a time in Georgia. So we were driving from Bogart, Georgia to our church in Athens. And just all the yelling and screaming and crying and everybody getting into the car. We're going to get in the car. We're going to be late for service. Right? There's a lot of chaos. And then in the parking lot, it's like, stop crying. We have to go to church. And it's like, wow, all of that. That's what's making me laugh, because I can smell it. I can see it still of just the agitation. And then everybody had to regulate to then go into church. And I'm guessing, well, maybe that's only us, but I'm guessing that's a lot of pressure to perform. And then, okay, now we have to put on a show, which isn't the gospel. It isn't what that's about.
No.
And yet we felt, and we lived that out.
Right.
And I want to free people up from that.
Right. To show up as who you are.
Yeah.
Whether you're fully dressed or fully wipe the tears off your face or not.
That's right.
And for churches themselves too, I think there's been a lot of pressure for churches to show, that they're doing all right by growing numbers and by measuring things in terms of how many people are showing up.
Yeah.
And that's also a false sense of pressure and perfection.
Yeah. To answer how we're doing.
Right.
How would you measure how you're doing as a church?
Right. How would you?
I don't think it's about number of people.
Well, and it's hard to measure process. And that's the problem. It's hard to measure how connected are people. How do they feel heard and loved? And you can't really have a chart for that. So it's harder to measure. Therefore, it's harder to set that as any kind of marker of how well we're doing. So people love to know, well, if we're doing well, it must mean more people are going to come in
Yep.
and invite their friends. But then that becomes what we're shooting for.
And it leans into then we take more responsibility for things than really grace, right? And that's the whole thing about scripture, that we can't do it ourselves. The more we try, the more we're living in being in that space of being God ourselves, rather than realizing we need God and need to live into that. And so that this perfectionism can actually be pretty damaging in terms of intimate, vulnerable relationships. And church
Yeah,
is one place that happens.
it is.
The
Yeah.
elementary school is another place that we talked about.
Yes, and school and workplaces, I mean, how many people all just assume that somebody who's in a position ahead of them has a better life because they're making a higher salary, they drive a nicer car, that whole keeping up with the Joneses thing.
Yeah.
That's been around since before social media. You didn't have to have an Instagram to compare yourself to somebody in your neighborhood, and just assume because they got a new car or they went on vacation to Hawaii that they were doing great and that they were
Yeah.
loving life.
Yeah. I know, like for us, we travel to speak, but people are like, "Oh, it's nice that you get a vacation." It's like, oh, it's not a vacation. Like even like you said about Texas,
Yeah.
you were in the airport, in the car to the hotel, in the hotel, and then back to the airport.
Yeah. And the Alamo was literally 2 blocks away from my hotel, and I never got to even go to the Alamo.
Yeah, I think I remember something about the
I
Alamo.
knew you were going to say that.
This is the problem of 32 years together, is that even before I say it, you neurologically know
I mean, I think, yeah.
what's going to happen. Parenting is, so there's that kind of how do we measure up, and this pursuit for excellence that can get in the way. And so it's the looking for an outcome is problematic rather than attending the process, like you were saying. I find that with my students before we get to parenting, because we're going to talk about that.
That's on the other side.
Oh, that's on the other
I
side.
promise
of the
we're
notes.
getting there.
Okay.
We're getting there.
Okay. All
I
right.
know.
Slow down.
Yes, we will go to our professions and how we see that
Okay.
play out, because that's where we really have some stories too.
So we'll stick with parenting.
Well, I mean, we kind of covered that, like, the whole bragging about your children's accomplishments and that being your measure of how your family is doing. And that just leads to people then feeling ashamed. I mean, one of the stories of that is a lot of our kids, when they graduated from high school, you see a lot of the posts in social media about the colleges that students got into, or the
that's right.
awards they got, or
The number of ribbons they had on their shoulders.
and we love to post those things, and we've posted those things, but then you find out later that there was quite a large, especially because our kids were doing a transitional time during COVID when things were really topsy-turvy for that age group. And there were a lot of kids who went off to college and then came home, like just kind of dropped out or weren't doing well in the first year and came home. And I would find that out later. You'd see those kids working local jobs and go, oh, you don't hear about those stories. That's
Right.
not what's posted on social media. The kid who was the subject of a post that they got into some Ivy League school, and then you see them 6 months later and they're working, in town because they've needed to recalibrate. But we're not telling those stories.
Yeah.
So we're thinking we're the only ones if we're not doing well, or our kid isn't doing well, or they're not getting the awards. You think, well, I have no story to tell because we're not doing well. But maybe your child is volunteering with, if rescued animals or something, and they're showing other measures of what is being a successful human being.
Well, and I think about like posting, right? So the social media piece of, I don't think we're saying, post all the failures on social media. I think it's where are we going to look for the process that's best for us as a couple, us as parents, for our kids. Because
we're not giving a what to do and what not to do here.
No, and I think that it's dangerous to go to social media for the expectations. It's what relationships do you have that you're able to talk about these things with people? And then it's about talking about the full range of things, the good and the bad.
Yeah.
I know we've had conversations when we were struggling, our kids were struggling, our parents were struggling, close friends that we could be open and honest. And that gave perspective that was really helpful. If we'd only gone to social media, or if we just posted all of that on social media, that's not helpful. It's not good for our relationships, and it's not helpful. So I'm not saying post all of your painful things on social media either.
No, and we have no checklist about how to handle social media. It's really more of where are we going to get away from our own tendency towards pushing for perfection.
Yeah.
And social media is the place that's going to make it worse.
That's true.
Because no matter what we decide to post or not post, it's always going to be out there, those perfect pictures that make us think we're doing less.
Yeah.
Or doing a worse job.
I know. I was, the ideas that the Slovakian parents had around social media were like having media Sabbaths or media diets. They called them media diets, which I thought was great. Of like, we're going to go for a week without any phone, social media, or we're going to like put all the phones in a basket at dinner time. So it was not like you don't have it, but how do you have a different relationship with it? Yeah. And if you can't be separate from it, then that's a sign of, it's a problem. But that's for another conversation. So, all right, where are we in this?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well,
this is all over the place.
We can go to where you've been trying to go with your academics, because I think that's a place where you see it a lot.
Yeah.
And where you see people struggling with comparison.
I have this where like people apply, it's the application process now. And I get to talk to prospective students and they're like, what will help me get in? And, my dean was like, you might want to change your speech. Because the last time I said, I really don't like 4.0 students. And she was like, yeah, maybe you can change that a little bit. But the point was, if you're a 4.0 student, that
meaning
goes
they're getting their straight
perfect
A's.
grades.
Perfect. Yeah.
That they're not ideal for clinical work. That the mechanism to be a 4.0, you're a really hard worker, but you're a hard worker towards a certain goal. A certain outcome. That's really bad for therapy, because we're not smart enough as clinicians to say, oh, you want this, I'll help you get there. And so 4.0 students tend to lean into that of like, I want the right answer. Tell me what the right marriage looks like. What are the right parenting techniques? And my answer is always, it depends.
It's different for every situation.
And they hate me for it. Because it's not a tick, it's not a box, it's not an outcome. It's how are you entering in, and really kind of the systems way is this way of our way of interacting might be problematic. I help identify that and not let that happen and see what emerges, which is different than saying, oh, if you just do X, Y, and Z, you'll have a happy marriage. And so when we think about students, when we think about the kind of performance focus, there has to be, yes, I want you to work hard. I want you to study. And I want you to be able to be free to realize you are an expert at the process and not at the outcome. And it's hard. And having to challenge the students away from that. So I give an assignment, one of my first assignments. I don't know if I want to say this out loud.
Maybe you shouldn't,
Maybe
because
I
it's
shouldn't.
a surprise if they join the program.
They won't listen to the podcast before the program, or before they're in the program. So it's an assignment.
This is really better if it's a surprise for those students, though. Because if they know the answer, they're gonna.
Okay, all right.
Or though maybe that's a good thing that you'll identify the ones who have been listening to you.
Oh. Now I don't know what the right answer is. So I'm gonna say I give an assignment, and it's a paper, and I don't list how many pages. And when we're reading the assignment, about 7 hands out of 18 go up and like, how long does this paper need to be?
Yeah.
And I say it needs to be long enough to do the task, but not so long that it makes me angry. And then the next hand goes up.
How many pages make you angry?
Exactly. And I'm like, questions like this. But it's about statistics, right? So a class of 18, if I say it's a 20-page paper, what is the probability that 18 people will have 20 pages of information to share with me on that prompt? It's very low. And yet, if I say maximum 20 pages, I'll get 18 pages, 18 people writing exactly 20 pages. And so they're writing to the number, and not many of them have 20 pages worth of information to share. So you know what's in there?
A lot of filler.
A lot of filler. And guess what filler does?
Makes you angry.
Makes me angry. But that's the educational system of like, oh, it needs to be a 20-page paper.
Yeah.
Well, all that's saying is I need this many words rather than your thought process. And when you're done, you're done.
Right.
But that takes a level of presence, of confidence, of purpose that's different than I'll just do whatever you tell me to do, or I'll go to the spot.
Yeah.
All right. So there's I've been holding on to that. It feels so good to share.
I'm sorry that we
had it on the back sheet.
we delayed it for so long. But I've heard a similar thing from business people too, that they don't look for the straight A student when they're hiring. They prefer a B student because the same reason, even though business is much more black and white than therapy is, it's still the same concept that A student might just be good at just doing exactly what they're told and not working as hard. They either have the ability to just spit stuff back at you exactly the way you want it. And then the B or C student might be somebody that's always had to work harder.
Yeah.
And they're not as obsessed with perfection, which can be a plus.
Yeah, I think there's data out there. Like I know George W. Bush would always be very happy to say he was a C student, and yet he became the president of the United States.
Well,
he had the point being, entrepreneurs, kind of thinkers out of the box, are going to probably not be the dot the I's, cross the T's kind of people. They're going to try different things. They're not going to do the right answers for the right reasons. And
they'll be more okay with making some mistakes in the process.
So how about birth? How's perfection in birth? Like, what's a perfect birth? I've been always curious to see what a perfect birth is.
Yeah. So in my profession, shooting for perfection is not a good idea either. Because it is all about what's the expectation, what's the measure of success for whatever we're talking about, right? And you're right. It's not in birth, it's not a good place to shoot for the perfect birth, but that's definitely a thing that happens.
Yeah, your feeds sometimes have these beautiful black and white pictures.
You shouldn't be looking at my Instagram feeds. But that's a problem. I mean, now that there's so much information out there, a lot of people are getting their information from TikTok and Instagram and whatever new social media thing is out there. And so they are seeing people post these just beautifully lit, quiet, perfectly, and they're not seeing the 36 hours it took either to get there. They're seeing the last 10 minutes where they joyfully welcome the baby without all the sweat and blood and everything before that.
So they sanitize, they clean up
Yes, and there's a wide range of what happens in birth. And if we're defining perfection by, I want it to be serene, and I want to be quiet, and I want it to be in a pool with, Christmas lights around, that's very small percentage of people who that's going to happen to. So we're getting our definition of what our expectations are for what's possible. And I want people to know that there's a possibility that things won't be as bad as they think they will either. But
we're not saying it's going to be horrible.
No,
because that happens too,
but
right?
Also, I have attended some births where there's a lot of noise and a lot of mess and a lot of twists and turns. And that person at the end says, that was amazing. Yeah. And it was. Yeah. Because they felt strong and they overcame challenges, and that, it looks very different than the pictures that some people are striving for. And I even had somebody very close to me say, when, talking about their birth, what if I don't rock my birth? Yeah. Because that's what they're hearing. Oh, that person, she crushed it. She rocked her birth. And my response was, you can't not, because you're going to, because you're going to learn something about yourself in the process.
Yeah.
And actually that person, it did not go in the way that they had hoped
Scripted
in their
it out.
checklist,
Yeah.
but they did rock it because they learned that they were strong in a different way. And
do it with support and the
I
whole
always
process around it.
think that birth is a good metaphor for any of the things we're talking about, because it is not plannable.
No.
It's not controllable. And yet it happens every day.
I know.
And we have to learn something from it.
And you think of all the books, I mean, all the education, which is really helpful to understand your body, understand the process, but all of that's about process and not about, okay, if you do this, if you eat this, if you do these exercises, this will be the outcome. That's a lie.
Yes. And yet we have to have some sort of something that we're shooting for.
Right.
Because if we, and when I help people write their birth preferences, we try to avoid calling it a plan, because plan makes us think it's a checklist. And if I check these things off, it will have been a success.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the objection some people have to birth plans.
Yeah.
Because it feels like a failure if it doesn't go to plan. But I like to think of a vision, like have a vision. And partly the vision for me is how people are going to treat you. How are you going to feel supported? How are you going to feel like you're making decisions? Like you're part of the process. Things aren't just happening to you like they can in life.
Yeah.
Like if we have no vision for where we want to go in life, we can also feel like we're just carried with the tides, or we're stationary, or we have inertia. And so in birth, having a vision is helpful, but not an inflexible plan.
Yeah. Well, and one of the businessmen I talked with this weekend said, what you're talking about is underneath it all, what are your values?
Yes.
And how do you live out your values?
Yes.
Because the outcome can be lots of different things. It can be a value of a healthy baby, or it can be a value of it draws you all together. There's a valuing that's the outcome, not a vaginal birth or a 4.0 degree or this kind of job for a profession. And I thought that was brilliant by this guy, because it was like, oh yeah, even though I hadn't been talking about that, that's the underlying piece of process, is a value that guides us. And if we have that value.
Interesting that he said that, because I do that in birth planning. I call it the values-based birth plan.
Yeah.
But it would be interesting to apply that to other things in life, like finding your career.
Education plan,
exactly. Because when I tell people when they're making their birth plan, we can't guarantee any of these outcomes.
Yeah.
So much of it is not controllable. But if your value is that, we always keep our sense of humor.
Yeah.
That would be one that maybe happens in our family, that we always want to be able to laugh at ourselves. We always want to be able to find the humor in the situation and share that with the people around us, keep things lighter.
Yeah.
You can have a birth that goes sideways, or you can have a sports game that ends in a crushing loss. But if you keep your sense of humor, because that's your value, and you find a way to laugh about it with somebody or laugh about something, you've kept that value, and you can find that, like, some success in that.
Yeah. And our value is, how do we learn from difficult, painful things?
Yeah.
I mean, we use the silly thing, W's and L's, wins and learnings.
Instead of wins and losses, you're winning or you're learning.
And we do a lot of learning. But that's a value that, things not going our way doesn't mean that it's a loss in terms of brokenness. It means there's things that we can do differently, and there's ways we can respond differently. And here's an opportunity to look at that playfulness, that humor, and that going, I'm going to learn from hard things. I'm going to learn from painful things.
That's a big piece of resiliency.
Yeah.
Because when we think about the parenting and the birth stuff, I was thinking about, in our path to becoming parents, we had several losses, like really difficult losses at a difficult time in our lives.
Yeah.
Where you were in school and we were
absent.
Well, you were working hard to get to where you are now.
Yeah.
And and school was part of that. But, having a loss, I discovered that by sharing that with other people, because having a miscarriage or a failure sometimes, and miscarriage is not a failure, but
Yeah.
but things that people often don't talk about are
Yeah.
the things that they think other people didn't go through this,
Yeah.
or this is hard to share because, it's making me feel vulnerable or whatever. But by sharing that, I learned how common it is, and I built a strong connection with a lot of the other moms who heard my story and said, I've had a loss too. And it built connection. And then we said, it was a painful thing, but it also really deepened my sense of compassion and my ability to connect with other people who were grieving later on in life. So that's the way we've always looked at those things. And it really helps with how we cope with it and then how we build resiliency in our own life.
Well, and our ability to talk through that and painful things, like I was not present for lots of different reasons, but learning from that of you saying, this is how alone and hurt gave me an opportunity to respond differently. But your openness and then my ability not to go shame and cut off and just retreat, but go, okay, how are we going to do this differently? Strengthened through pain our connection.
Yeah. Yeah. Because we had to talk about it.
Yeah. With that businessman, we were talking about succession planning. So it was value based, but it was how do we transition? So it's kind of that life transition idea of how do we do transitions? And we can have a plan, and we need to realize there might be recalculating.
Right. And if the plan changes, what are we still holding on to? What's really important here?
Yeah. So I like that. We're going to have to think more about
Yeah,
that
I like that too.
Value planning.
Yeah, because that could be applied to a lot of things. So just our kind of
some
our takeaways of this.
We've been all over the place. So,
I hope you're
why
following
don't you
us.
just email us what you think the takeaways are? And then, we can sum up.
Yeah. And I think obviously, we're saying the comparison game can rob you of joy. And so comparing yourself, whether it's through social media or whether it's through some illusion of what you think, a family is doing, or a couple's relationship that seems closer than yours, or, whatever, a person farther along in their career, that can lead to shame if we just hold that as our comparison, if we hold that as what we think we should be striving for, or we even hold that as reality.
Right.
Because it's only a small piece of reality.
Yeah. Well, it goes to like when you were saying, how do we measure a vibrant church? And if we're comparing it by numbers, that's going to focus on certain thing. The comparison is actually going to drive how and what you focus on. And so what's the value there that you're measuring yourself according to? And I think, and when we do that, it's valuing, the second thing would be valuing vulnerability.
Right. So how can we embrace vulnerability?
Yeah, and be transparent. And I would say the takeaway there is it's not being transparent with everyone all the time, right? Of like
because there can be too much.
That's a danger.
Yeah,
and that's not going to foster resiliency. That's going to foster more wounds. And so, what's the kind of congruence I think with vulnerability of how connected are you with this person?
Right.
That should have some guideline of how vulnerable to be. So you and me, ideally, we'd be completely vulnerable with each other. Same with God, but with the person at Trader Joe's that's checking when they say, "Oh, what are you having for dinner?" I want to say, "None of your business," because you're a complete stranger and I don't have to be vulnerable to you. There's probably some middle ground there.
Yeah, when they say, how's your day going? You don't have to tell them about all the bad things that happened.
Occasionally I do, to want to modify them from saying that ever again. So.
Yeah, but your point is like, you should share, the amount you should share should match with the safety you have in that relationship.
Yes.
So when we say being vulnerable, that's not being totally honest about all your difficulties with everyone in your life.
Right. And especially on social media, it's like there are people that don't know you and you don't know them. How vulnerable are you being, both in terms of ideal, but also in terms of struggle? That it needs to be compensated well with the level of relationship that you have.
Yeah.
So that would
And
be
that's
the second
difficult
one.
on social media. So therein lies the problem. Maybe we
Yeah.
only share our strengths.
Let's just share food.
Yeah.
Pictures
Let's just
of
go back to
food.
food pictures.
Yeah, just food pictures.
Food and puppies.
Yeah, I don't
The
care about
pets.
puppies. I'll stick with food.
Yeah.
And
So
then,
I think just to do you had something you wanted to throw in there?
no, I think I'm done. I don't know what day is it? What
I
time
know.
is it? I'm kind of just slowly
Starting to
fading away.
fade.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the whole point of what we've been saying is that it's about what our expectations are. So it's redefining what is success.
Yeah,
How about we
yeah.
define success differently?
Yeah.
Or define what we're shooting for differently? Because I think now there's an emphasis on numbers, power, beauty, wealth. We're comparing how things look,
Yeah.
even with our food,
Yeah.
to somebody else's food, or how we look personally, how much money we have, how much power we have, how many people are coming to our things, how many followers you have, whatever.
Oh, you had to go there, right? It's all the outcome rather than
Right.
process.
I mean,
Yeah.
but that's the
us.
trap. That's
Yeah.
the trap of what we're comparing to, and that somebody's always farther along in that than we are. But what if we valued connection, effort, and growth?
Yeah.
You can't really have you can have somewhat of a measure for defining you've come farther than you were before, but
Yeah.
if we put an emphasis on that, that's kind of about the process.
I've been in airports a lot and sitting around in airports in lots of different countries, and the news is the sporting news is similar all across, and it goes to this: teams that lost badly, they say, we just want to get better. Which is different than we want to get this many wins. It's how each practice, each day, each game, we're better than we were before, which is different than this amount of points. And that goes to the growth. I think we can measure that. It's like, have you done a little bit better today? What would be a small thing that you could say, oh, I've learned, I've grown? And it means looking at the vulnerable piece, means looking at your challenges. Because none of us really I don't know if you I don't like looking at the struggles and the failures.
Yeah.
I mean, the default is push it down. But if we look at it, we can do a little bit better. And whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
And that can be hopeful. So we want to free people from thinking that perfection is the goal.
Yeah.
It's we are all far from perfection.
Yeah.
And we don't want you to fall into traps that lead to more suffering.
And we'll never be there.
No.
It's not even like we're getting a little closer to perfection. We'll
No.
never be perfect.
Yeah, it's like the horizon, right? We can see the horizon. We take a step, and each step we're still that much
I don't
farther
even know
from
what the horizon looks like.
Well,
But
let me tell you. Well, maybe we'll talk about that after we turn off the mics.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we hope this has been interesting, and we look forward to sharing with you from some of our other travels coming up. So stay tuned, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah.